Most of us can remember a time in our childhood when we gathered with playmates and clasping hands created a whirling circle while chanting this seemingly playful nursery rhyme. Ironically, most scholars believe that this traditional rhyme was inspired not by children at play, but by victims of the plague. We'll learn a bit more about how this Old English rhyme and the plague are connected in a moment. Before we do, let's look at some background information. The plague, also referred to as the Black Death or the Great Mortality, first swept across Europe in the 1340s. This initial epidemic lasted about 5 years, from 1347 to 1351, and the death toll in Europe was so severe that one chronicler of the period wrote in his journal, "This is the end of the world." Where the disease originated is inconclusive, but most scholars cite either China or Inner Asia as the point of origin. The infection spread to medieval Europe by way of the Mediterranean port cities. The first outbreak occurred in Sicily in 1347, when several Genoese galleys put into port at Messina. Within days, people, along with their livestock, cats and dogs, fell ill. The epidemic then quickly spread through Italy, beginning in Pisa and moving inland to Florence, Siena, and Rome. One Italian writer noted that by the summer of 1348, hardly a person was left alive. It entered France that same year through Marseille and rapidly made its way to Paris, then swept into Spain by way of Barcelona and Valencia. By the end of the year, it found its way to England via ships carrying French goods out of the port city Bordeaux. The French furs and linen so highly valued in English homes also came with plague-infected fleas. In 1349, the Holy Roman Empire felt the scourge, as did Hungary and Poland. By 1351, the Scandinavian countries in the Baltic region were also infected. But what has all this to do with our study of art? The arts not only mirror what is happening in a culture, the imagery and motifs used by the artists also give us insight into how these events are affecting the people in the culture. This is certainly true with regard to the Black Death. The psychological havoc of the plague years was vividly expressed through the death imagery in the paintings and woodcuts, morality plays, epic poems, and rhymes, which brings us back to Ring Around the Rosie. When placed in historical context, we discover that the opening phrase of this rhyme is referencing symptoms of the plague, in particular, the bubonic strain of the illness. This strain, the most common, was transmitted through fleas that had become infected by rats and other rodents. The bacteria from the flea bites would attack the victim's lymph system. The infected glands would then fill with blood, producing egg-shaped buboes, hence the name. These eventually burst, spreading the disease throughout the bloodstream and producing black, purplish welts, or rosy rings. The second line of the rhyme alludes to another form of the illness that settled in the lungs. This pneumonic strain, called the coughing plague, was transmitted directly from person to person. In addition to violent coughing, the victims also suffered fever, delirium, and what chroniclers describe as the smell of death. This last symptom gave rise to the belief that the disease was spread through bad smells, and people of the time were thus encouraged to gather pockets full of posies or sweet-smelling herbs to protect themselves. However, as the final line insinuates, such precautions were futile. So many people were dying that finding a place to bury the dead grew increasingly difficult. Thus, many of the corpses were cremated. It is uncertain whether this rhyme originated in 1348 during the first wave of the epidemic, or in 1665 during a second great outbreak. A few recent critics date it even later. Most scholars, however, favor one of the two early dates and the plague interpretation. The plague peril also gave rise to a medieval convention that became known as the Dance of Death. In this dance, death is personified as an all-conquering, equalizing power. The best-known pictorial illustrations are the drawings of the German artist Hans Holbein the Younger. These two examples show his skill in capturing the concept. In each drawing, he creates unique but equally grotesque and terrifying visions of death. Notice, too, that in both drawings there is an hourglass, a symbol of the transience of life. Some in the 1300s sought to drown their fear of death in hedonism. Others of the time turned in prayerful supplication to Saint Sebastian. Now, Sebastian's story is intriguing, and his attribute, the arrow, essential in understanding his connection to this virulent disease. In religious iconography, the arrow generally represents a spiritual weapon used in executing God's judgment. Saint Sebastian, who supposedly survived being shot by arrows, became the patron saint of plague victims. According to legend, Sebastian was a young Christian officer in Diocletian's elite Praetorian Guard. Sebastian did not initially reveal his Christianity, but when two of his fellow officers were being tortured for their faith, Sebastian stepped forward to encourage them to die rather than renounce Christ. Hearing of Sebastian's admonitions, Diocletian called him to appear before him and demanded that he renounce the faith. When Sebastian refused, the emperor ordered that he be bound to a stake and shot to death with arrows. Sebastian's fellow officers immediately carried out the order and left Sebastian for dead. However, Irene, the mother of one of the martyred friends, discovered that he was still alive. Rescuing him, she dressed his wounds and nursed him back to health. The fact that he survived Diocletian's attempt to kill him with arrows encouraged desperate plague victims to look to him as their patron saint and pray to him for their deliverance. Paintings of Sebastian were extremely popular. In these artistic renderings, Sebastian is always portrayed as a young man. Irene and a servant are also frequently supporting characters within the scene. These two are in Bigot's stark, brooding painting of Sebastian. Bigot began his training in France, but soon moved to Rome, where he came under the influence of Caravaggio. Caravaggio was known for his revolutionary lighting effects, and this work clearly illustrates Caravaggio's influence on Bigot's technique. Notice how the artist's lighting frames the focal point of composition. Bigot uses the lantern's illumination to direct our eye to Irene's face and to the arrow she is carefully extracting. This Dutch work, by Barberin, draws attention to another Caravaggesque innovation, the use of live models. Compare the faces of these figures with those in Bigot's work. The figures are not simply realistic, but also ethnically distinct. Barberin's figures are clearly Dutch, Bigot's distinctly French. Another intriguing contrast between these two works is how each artist uses space. Bigot specialized in candlelit, half-length figure compositions as seen here. The technique creates a dramatic, intimate scene, much like a filmic close-up. Like Bigot, Barberin uses lighting and dramatically posed figures, but he pulls the camera back to reveal more of the scene. The entire figure of Sebastian, not just the arrow in his wound, dominate this picture. And we see in his pose more of the physical anguish produced by the ordeal. There is little evidence of that anguish in this elegant portrait by Guido Reni. That is not to say that the work is void of emotion. Reni boasted that he could paint heads with their eyes uplifted in 100 different ways and give form to a state of ecstasy and divine inspiration. In this portrait, we see little of the revolutionary naturalistic style popularized by Caravaggio. Here we see the influence of the more classical style of the Renaissance champion, Raphael. The Florentine painter of this half-length portrait, André del Sarto, would die of the plague in 1530. We'll look at this work, along with several other Mannerist painters, in our next session.